Hello and welcome to the finale in our three-part seminar series, brought to you by CIPS in partnership with S&P Global. Thank you very much to S&P Global for supporting this webinar series and bringing some fabulous insights to them. So don't worry if you've missed the other two, because we recorded them. We'll send you the links, and we're also recording this session too, so you can watch it back again or share with colleagues afterwards, and then you'll have the whole set of three. So today, in our final series, we are talking about why it's necessary to start looking at getting smart with third-party risk management, or TPRM. We do like an acronym. I'm going to get our panel to introduce themselves to us, to everyone in a sec. Let us know where you've tuned in from in the chat. Make sure you network with other people who have joined us. Also, if you've got a question for our panel, if you could submit it in the Q&A box right down in the middle here, and I will get to them. I won't leave them all to the end, so make sure you get them in there nice and early. If there seems an appropriate point to bring in a question, then we'll do that, but we'll also leave some time at the end too, so don't leave it too late. So without further ado, I will allow our panel to introduce themselves. James, welcome. Want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so thank you, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. So my name is James Westgarth. I'm in charge of procurement, performance and systems at the Lufthansa Group, and third-party supply chain risk management is a subject very close to my heart, so I'm very happy to be part of the panel today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks. And Kate?
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to CIPS for hosting us today. I'm Kate Aziz. I am the head of the TPRM advisory and managed service business here at KY3P, know your third party that is part of S&P Global. I've been working within TPRM for about 10 years, primarily in the financial services industry, for the majority of which I've sort of been building and maintaining TPRM programs within a large global investment bank. So looking forward to the topic today and, discussing some of the themes that we hope would be useful for the audience.
Great, thanks for joining us, Kate. And Rogier?
Hi, Emma, and hi all. My name is Rogier Minsbergen. As Kate, I'm also part of the KY3P team. I'm a director responsible for the business development in the EMEA region. So that goes from everything that we do on our KY3P platform to our data utility, our assessment services, managed services, and advisory services, all focused on TPRM. And happy to be here today talking about operational efficiency in this space.
Excellent. Well, on that point, let me start with a question for you first then, and then we'll kick off. So remember, post your questions as we come along. So as we're all aware, economic turmoil, geopolitical tensions mean we live and work and trade in an area of unprecedented complexity and disruption. I don't think anyone would argue that it's such a hiatus at the moment. We've all lived with different amounts of disruption, but to have so much all at once in such concentrated, it is really unprecedented. And unsurprisingly, this is impacting our global supply chains. Let's start our discussion by addressing what kind of vulnerabilities we are facing here when it comes to third-party relationships. And speaking of risks, what are the main categories of risk? If you want to start setting the scene by covering some of that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think this is indeed a good question to set the scene. And as you said, so we really live in unprecedented times. I think if you look over the last couple of years, we had a lot of events happening that led to supply chain disruptions, right? Think about, everybody can remember, we're still partly in it, COVID-19, leading to lockdowns, leading to literally blockage of supply chains. Things that are still also very present is shortages of raw materials. That's in particular important for physical supply chains, manufacturing companies. We have the energy crisis, reinforced, I think, by the war in Ukraine, leading to increased prices, inflation that affects supply chains, sometimes even leading to disruptions. Physical incidents, with the incidents in the Suez Canal, for example, the obstruction of the Ever Given that blocked literally one of the arteries of the supply chains right around the world. And then, of course, all the cyber attacks that we see on macro scale, micro scale. So there are plenty of examples of disruptions, and there are other drivers too that I didn't even mention. I think studies also show this, right? So we have a report published from S&P Global, but also the Business Continuity Institute shows this, that since 2019, you really see an increase, or organizations are reporting an increase in their disruptions, significant increases. So we see this throughout the industry. And when we talk about TPRM, we are talking about making sure that you protect yourself, right, from these disruptions in the supply chain and from an operational resilience perspective, and in particular through managing your suppliers. So although this is a bigger topic, obviously supply chain and supply chain resilience, we look at it from a TPRM perspective, and how can you manage that? How can you build resilience through managing your suppliers? I think that's also important to set the scene. But back to the question about risk types. Well, just looking at questions that we get from our customers and prospective customers, or when we look at the industry. Well, to start with, financial strength is obviously an important element. It's always an important element, and it remains an important element. And especially when you have, for any organization, but when you have physical supply chains, manufacturing companies, and you have a large dependency for a longer term on suppliers, this becomes even more important, right? You want to make sure that they're financially healthy and that they don't go into default after a couple of months while you just launched a new product with them, right? If you have a longer term dependency, that's very important. We have ICT risks like cyber, physical security risk, data protection, very regulated in the FS world, financial services world, maybe less regulated in the non-financial services world, but still very important. We have seen cyber attacks in almost any industry, right? And a lot of these cyber attacks are actually coming through the suppliers, through third parties that are working on software systems, networks, etc. in those organizations. So IT cyber risk is a very important domain. Compliance related risk, and I think this you can split into two, right? Financial crime related risks, anti-money laundering, sanctions, anti-bribery, etc. So we get a lot of requests from clients on this angle to do screening, but also from a regulatory compliance, right? You want to ensure that your supplier meet the criteria and meet the regulatory criteria to ensure that they're compliant also with supplying your products. And then last but not least, I mean, the buzzword ESG. It's a very, very important angle. And again, this is a world on its own, right? We have the environmental aspects, we have the human rights aspects. So these are the risk domains that clients ask us, and that the clients ask us to manage for them. And maybe looking at the topic of the webinar today, so we're speaking about operational efficiency and how that can be gained. And you can all look at these risk types in silos, but I think it's important that you look at it from a holistic perspective, that you have a program, that you have a function that doesn't look at it in silos. And this is what we sometimes see happening in clients, like they manage these risks in silos or standalone. But what we think is that it's good to look at it from a holistic perspective, manage it from a central perspective, and only through that way you can actually obtain those efficiencies. And also from a risk perspective, have the good view, have the holistic view on the suppliers, what they really do. So I think this is it. Maybe one thing that I forgot is reputational risk, obviously, which is not maybe a thing on it standalone, but is actually a result of all those risks, right? If you don't manage them, you actually run a big reputational risk as well. So this is, I think, just for setting the scene, this is an overview of the risk domains. Yeah.
And I think that interconnectivity of those risks is really important, and the overlap. And you're absolutely right in not looking at that in isolation, and then having that helicopter view as well on the reputational risk that sits above all of it. Absolutely. James, if I can come to you and look a bit further, a bit closer about how we approach such a complex and volatile risk landscape. and taking that holistic approach to strategy, to risk strategy with third parties, and why that's so important. If you can give us a little bit of take on that and what you're doing in your organisation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a great question, because taking this kind of holistic approach is very important, because I think what's important is we have to consider that third-party risk management is not just an end in itself. It's a means to a greater end of ensuring that the supply chain as a whole is working well, is efficient, but also is effective. And just listening to Roger there and his kind of shopping list of risks that he read through, it's the stuff of nightmares, right? And you wonder why any of us are working in procurement and supply chain management at all. But fortunately, there are good methods out there. There are good technological solutions coming onto the market, which enable us to manage these risks. And I think it can be very easy to get confused and a little bit lost in this kind of minefield of risk management, because what we found is that, yes, when you talk about ESG risk, for example, that can sometimes, there can be an overlap with another discussion which may go over more into reputational risk, also, and then the reputational risk may have an overlap into financial risk, and so on. And so with all these overlaps taking place, it's very easy to get confused. It's very easy with different stakeholders in the organization to kind of to start talking, if you will, at kind of cross purposes. And so having the holistic approach kind of eliminates all that, and you say, okay, what I want to achieve here is I want to have a supply chain that has an overall mitigated risk, which leads me to a situation where when I am qualifying a supplier or when I'm running an RFP, then I know from the get-go that I have my tick boxes checked, and I know that when I have my long list or my short list of suppliers, then I don't have to worry about getting to the end of an RFP process and finding out that the chosen supplier, the one that's won on, let's say, price or is won on technological ability, finally is not able to be selected because of a reputational issue or financial solvency problem or something like that. So I think if you're able to cover that up front, in a holistic way, by kind of checking off all the boxes, then you're on a good track.
And although that some of those issues are interconnected, they can also conflict with each other as well, I guess, and butt up against each other. And I guess it's understanding what it is that you're trying to achieve, and balancing some of those conflicts. I mean, a decision on a sourcing strategy, for instance, may not produce the best sustainability outcomes, but I guess it depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve, which risk has a bigger impact to your organization. Would any of you agree with any of that?
Yeah, if I can jump in, Emma. Yeah, I think it's a really good and important point. We see it with clients. I seen it in a previous role, and you're right. There is this sort of fine balancing, I think, of risk versus how much reward you can get from buying those services in, and I think there's been sort of an interesting evolution in sort of supply chain risk, in that historically it's all been about identifying and managing the risk. I think now the industry is moving towards how do we remain resilient. We know that there will be disruption. It is going to happen. I think people are starting to accept that even with the best risk management frameworks, disruption will occur. We've seen it over the last 2-3 years. There's been a lot of it. So how can we evolve our framework, our practices and our policies to ensure that we can manage successfully through that? So whether it is, doing really, really strong exit planning, but also treating your suppliers as a partnership rather than sort of beating them all over the head. We'll talk a little bit around some of those sort of the data and the due diligence processes a little bit later. But I've seen that as more of an evolution. It may be in the last sort of few years of, okay, this is a risk management requirement, but actually business disruption is inevitable. We need to get smarter around how we can manage successfully through that. And I think that that balance of how much we focus on one particular risk over another is part of that.
Yeah, if I can add also something to that, what Kate just mentioned, because this is a very important point, but it's even also in supporting your providers, right? So if you assess the risk and you do that from a holistic perspective, so you have the entire view, you're completely right, Emma. Some risks will be more present than others, but it's also, as Kate mentioned, having that partnership with your providers to ensure that you can help them, support them in jumping up to that next level if there is an area of higher risk. So partnering up with them is definitely one of the key points. And through managed services, Kate can speak about that for hours, but yeah, you can do that. So
yeah, and I would just agree with my fellow panelists. I think what we're finding is that more than ever, companies are judged on the quality of their supply chains. And when I speak to my CFO, he will tell me that when he goes on investor roadshows, the question that comes up more and more is, what are you doing to mitigate supplier risk? How is the quality of your supply chain looking like? How environmentally sustainable is your supply chain? So, you know, it's not just, I would say, important to mitigate third-party risk from an ethical perspective, but also it makes good business sense because, you know, in the end of the day, you know, I think what we're seeing certainly post-COVID, supply chain resilience, you know, you can make a direct correlation to, you know, the overall value of an organization.
Absolutely, more attractive to investors, more attractive to getting the best talent in your organization and retaining it, all of those things. Yeah, massive value add around there. Kate, if I can pick up that conversation around working with suppliers, what kind of benefits can procurement leaders expect to gain from creating a robust strategy for vetting suppliers and associated data around that?
Yeah, so it's I think, you know, we didn't intentionally sort of pick up the thread right in the last question, but, you know, absolutely there has been a bit of a power shift, I think, between sort of the buying firms and the suppliers. You know, you can just think about the big cloud providers right now, and, you know, you send out a due diligence questionnaire, and then you send one another year, and then another one, and the information is repetitive, it's duplicative. And we see it, right? We know that a lot of these suppliers just point blank, they refuse now to respond to those types of due diligence requests. So, and they know that they do have a lot more power. You know, there is this partnership that needs to be built between sort of the buying firm and the supply chain. And I think that needs to occur at the very start of an engagement. So, you know, during an RFP process. I think a lot of the clients that we are working with are really on that journey with us. They recognize that they need to get a lot smarter about how they risk assess and vet their suppliers. I think the first step is data. So we do have firms looking more and more to data. You know, we provide a lot of data. There's a ton of data out there in the market. But really looking at that pre and post contract due diligence and ongoing monitoring and what intelligence you can harness from data. So, you know, firms can obtain, I think, a pretty good or meaningful, I should say, level of assurance into a supplier's risk posture, either before committing to buying goods and services or invest in more spend and more resources into more traditional, I would say, invasive due diligence methods, whether they be sort of remote on-site assessments, going and eyeballing suppliers. So really taking a more data-driven approach to when your initial due diligence is just the smart thing to do. It can absolutely help if you're shortlisting third parties in a competitive process, but then leveraging that data as well once you get post-contracting into ongoing monitoring. So really moving away from, these annual point in time due diligence processes and leveraging a more intelligent approach by saying, okay, well, I've done my initial due diligence. Now I'm going to rely on these data feeds that I've got. And based on, the risk of my supplier, once, if, and hopefully this won't happen, but if there is a drop in their cybersecurity rating, maybe I'm just going to go out and look at that very specific risk domain area, figure out what's going on with our supplier, rather than sending them, a 200 question set due diligence or DDQ every year. So I think there's different ways that data can be harnessed. It absolutely is driving, I think, efficiency and a bit more of an intelligent approach. I would say the other sort of theme that we're seeing in the industry, and this is continuing to evolve, everyone's been talking about it for years, so we're still on a journey, is shared assessments and more consortia-led frameworks. I think different companies have different appetites there. It takes sort of organizations like ours to create those consortia, but we are seeing an increasing trend from firms and regulators, I would say, towards shared assessment frameworks. One, they drive convergence across different due diligence approaches. So they deliver, significant efficiency both to the suppliers and the buying firms. But I think importantly, they bring a lot of innovation and best practice sharing. So, not only does that benefit, I think, the buying firms, but ultimately it moves the industry towards sort of more resilient and robust supply chains.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting about that consistent approach as well. It really helps as well identifying those pockets of best practice and benchmarking yourself against others as well, really, to see how you're performing, as well as the benefits to all of the suppliers in submitting the same information. There's some real wins to be had there. A couple of points I wanted to bring out from that as well. And I guess we had a question through, like, do we do enough to encourage firms to assess risk before we've got a supplier on board, or are we putting too much time into, we'll worry about it when we're on board? And I guess you covered some of that in your discussion there, Kate, but I guess there's perhaps more that we can do to have that joint responsibility from a supplier and buyers on flagging risks, and encouraging just more open conversations around this thing. So more opportunities to discuss these kind of things regularly in between the reporting cycles, like you say, Kate, so that things naturally do arise through conversations that we're having with suppliers. And I know that you can't have that with absolutely every supplier, but your critical, most high risk ones, I guess we should be instilling some of that. James, what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, absolutely.
The many points that I made there. Sorry.
No, of course, and I think to your point on ensuring that the traditional buyer-supplier relationship just doesn't really cut it in today's world. You really need to have a profound relationship with your key suppliers in order to understand not just the current risk landscape, but what are future potential problems upcoming. And I think if there's any one key learning from, let's say, the last 2 or 3 years, is that having that intimacy with key suppliers is very important to understand where there are weak points or strong points in the relationship. I guess you can imagine in the aviation business, for Lufthansa, what happened during COVID with all the flights being closed down, and immediately, having to go into a kind of a crisis mode on securing cash from the supply chain, enabling certain or asking certain suppliers to help us out. Whereas, you'll be amazed in the aviation industry how similar the supply chain is across different airlines. And I think this is to Kate's point, is that in our industry, and I'm sure it's the case across most industries, is that a lot of the time that the supply chain is quite similar, meaning that when you're asking suppliers to do risk assessments, they will get the same survey or the same questionnaire from multiple customers, and therefore, we need to work together in a collaborative way to make sure that the risk assessments are efficient. And the way I see it is that, okay, yes, there is an inherent, let's say, benefit to that in terms of speed, in terms of time, in terms of lack of annoyance to the supply chain. But there's also a commercial benefit, because at the end of the day, if you increase bureaucracy to your suppliers, well, you're only going to find that in the unit price in the end. So in the end, it helps with savings to make sure things are as efficient and streamlined as possible in the supply chain. So that's something I think is as Kate said, it's kind of, we're on a journey there. We're not yet there on this kind of collaborative approach, but we're making good headway. And I think as this this supply chain risk management topic becomes more and more, I would say, to the fore, as it inevitably will do, then this will help, with this collaborative approach.
Absolutely, and it's kind of collaboration with suppliers, but also, like you say, either within your sector or not necessarily within your sector. So organizations or sectors that you have a common supply chain with, and having more transparency over what those common risks are, where you can collaborate in a without commercial conflict, would absolutely make sense. Yeah.
And if I could just add in this like little sort of anecdotal stat that always surprises people when we talk to them. But whenever we work with new and existing clients and we look at their due diligence, and everyone, is super proud, they've taken years to harness these brilliant due diligence processes that inevitably are between 200 and 300 questions, maybe more. And when we look at them, invariably, I would say between 80 and 90% of the questions are exactly the same as everyone else's.
Yeah.
And we tell them there's, an 80% overlap here. It's not that unique.
No.
You don't have to go that far to get to a more sort of shared assessment style framework. But yeah, that's just sort of a battle that everyone faces, but just an interesting stat, I think, to put out there.
And it's not one that you could differentiate yourself or maybe have competitive advantage on either, because, like we say, they are on the whole quite common about it.
It's the contrary, actually, right, Emma? So actually, if you leverage each other's sort of questions from a vendor perspective, it's efficient for them. So you make your vendors happy in the end, but also from an industry perspective and a risk perspective. If you use the same question sets, if you use the same methodologies, it becomes all more comparable, right, across the whole supplier set and supply chain. So from a risk perspective, having that comparability is key. If you do all your own risk assessment with your own questions, becomes incomparable, and it's impossible then to manage the supply chain resilience from a holistic perspective.
Absolutely, makes the number crunching much easier. Forgive me because I'm going to read this question because there's some stats in it and I want to make sure I get it right. So forgive me for not looking in the camera at the moment. So according to S&P Global Research, 44% of organizations score themselves as highly capable around strategy and process, but only 32% do the same around platforms and technology. So I guess it's moving that conversation on. So we capture all the right information, we get all the data. What is the technology that we can harness to gain efficiencies around some of this information? And Kate, can I go to you with any examples that clients that you've been working with have really got smart in terms of using technology to get better insights from all this information? So we're in danger of getting flooded with data that we have no idea how to manage.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, and I think some of the things that we've been talking about here, TPRM. Oh, sorry, Emma, can you just come back to me? I've just been interrupted in the room. I'm so sorry.
Of course.
I'll come back.
That's fine.
I'll come back to the question. I'm so sorry.
James, I'm going to come to you and ask you about. No problem at all.
No problem. Yeah, so I think it's a great question about how technology can be leveraged in order to tackle this risk mitigation topic. And I think just thinking about our own case here in the Lufthansa Group. So we're a large group, a matrix organization with many business units, many underlying instances of our ERP system, multiple layers, different technologies for our procurement setup, be it ordering or sourcing or reporting. And then, of course, if you add on top of that now the increasing need for third-party risk management, going out to third parties to assess suppliers for reputational risk, doing adverse media checks, that type of thing, then it can be very complex and quite daunting. And I think the key is to kind of build on a technological setup step by step, because of course I don't think anybody is really starting from zero. We've as procurement experts, we've all been looking at third-party risk management for some time, but perhaps at a slightly reduced scope. So, we've been looking at the financial risk of the supply base for some years, but now, of course, we need to build on that, and we need to say, okay, above and beyond that, now we need to look to ESG. We need to look to the carbon footprint of our supply base, for example, and we also need to think about the legislative framework, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. In particular, in Germany, we have this Supply Chain Due Diligence Act coming into force from the 1st of January, which will be a precursor to some EU legislation on the topic. And therefore, you need to think about, well, what technical solutions can we have in place which enables us to cover us from a technological perspective, but at the same time is, let's say, simple enough that we get a very easy answer to the question is, what is the overall supply chain risk for supplier X or supplier Y? So so it's a little bit complex to assess and look at, and I think it really depends on where a given company is on their, let's say, risk management technology journey, if I can call it like that. But nevertheless, I think there are a lot of technology companies, a lot of data providers are now really stepping up and understand the need that's there and filling that demand.
Absolutely. Rocky, if I could ask you to step in while Kate's still getting sorted, or she's back.
Yeah, sure.
Because I guess technology is just leapfrogging in this area in terms of getting smarter and using AI and God knows what else next to make better business decisions.
No, absolutely. And I think if you look 2-3 years back when we released, when everything started, regulations came on the financial services side, the EBA guidelines on outsourcing came, and all the financial services companies, banks in particular, started moving. We saw a lot of the uses of spreadsheets, Excel, sending it around, questionnaires to vendors, then evidence coming back via emails. It's unmanageable to do it like this. So having a platform that can support this due diligence process in an automated way is fundamental. You cannot do without. If you want to do a thorough risk assessment on, in particular, your critical suppliers, which go into hundreds, for some organizations, thousands of suppliers, it's inevitable. You need a platform that can support that can then host the evidence. There are platforms where can even do pre-scoring, right? So it comes back, answers, pre-scoring. These are all major efficiencies. Otherwise, you have to do this all manually. So that's the first thing. And I think the other thing that is very important, and Kate already touched upon this earlier, but it is that you have a platform or a technology that sort of combines data insights and then due diligence. So on your critical supplier set, you for sure have to do an in-depth due diligence, right? You cannot risk that anything happens to those critical suppliers that support or service critical services for your organization. But on that sort of other set, non-critical suppliers, which are the largest set actually, are you going to do a due diligence on all of them? That's a very heavy task. So use data screening insights upfront to maybe on that other set determine which suppliers are higher risk, which are lower risk, and on the higher risk suppliers, you can still decide to do an in-depth due diligence. And yeah, the really good platforms out there can manage that for you, right? So they can do that automatic screening, then they can already direct you there. Okay, these suppliers have to have an automated due diligence done. These can go through a straight through process. And this can lead to major efficiencies in your TPRM program. Yeah.
Thanks. And Kate, I think it's kind of choosing the most appropriate technology for the best category or supplier, I guess. And also, I guess, bring in something around skills. So are these new skill sets for procurement to get their head around? You know, I see all these different job titles popping up, like data scientists and you know, analysts and stuff. You know, we've always had those kind of analyst type skills in procurement, but are we seeing more of this and set to kind of go on the same trajectory, I guess?
Yeah, I think definitely within TPRM, it's interesting actually. We've recently done this analysis, and sorry about the disruption. I'm not sure if Rohia managed to refer to it, but we recently did an analysis where we looked at the typical tasks associated with third-party risk, supply chain risk management, who performs them, and you know where you can find efficiency both through people, but you know technology. And I know we just spent you know quite a bit of time talking about technology, but TPRM does have a specific, I think, a fairly unique skill set. It's becoming more demanding. I think what is, I guess, somewhat unique with TPRM is it's relatively new in terms of a risk domain and expertise. What that means is anyone that has experience within supply chain risk, within TPRM, is likely to be relatively more senior, therefore they're expensive. They're going to be in expensive locations. And retaining that talent can be a challenge. TPRM is inherently, right now, as it stands today, is inherently administrative. So I think what firms can really do here is look at the typical tasks, or look at those tasks that they are asking their teams to execute, and figure out where they can outsource some of that. There's a lot of activity that we see as being ripe for outsourcing. Anything that's repetitive, supplier onboarding, data input, sending, receiving due diligence questionnaires. You know, you can drive a lot of efficiency through technology. You can drive even more efficiency if you outsource some of that to managed service providers. You're talking sort of at least 40 to 50% in operating efficiency. So that is, you know, significant cost reductions, but importantly, you can drive significant risk reduction as well. I think what that then means for your internal teams is they can really free up their time, their valuable time, to focus on the much more strategic value add activities that typically need to remain in-house, setting strategy, managing risk, defining the risk appetite, rather than just managing the administration and the process that is inherently part of supply chain risk and third-party risk management.
Absolutely. I think you look like you're agreeing there, James. And I think in order to attract and retain talent, we can't have people doing this such manual processes day in, day out. And more young people are expecting organizations to have a grip on technology to take away some of this process. You know, if we're going to attract and retain the best talent, this is where the space that we really have to be in.
Absolutely, and there's nothing worse for a category manager or a senior buyer to be burdened by repetitive, administrative, bureaucratic work. That's really a big no-no. And as you say, we're in a war for talent, and we need to make sure that we retain that talent by offering not only the right packages financially, but also jobs which are interesting and value adding and make life enjoyable. Just thinking back to your answer there, Kate, this removal of the repetitive work, but nevertheless delivering valuable information to the organization. is absolutely key in my view. And we're really working towards a scenario where we get inputs on this third-party risk assessments, where we're able to say on a category by category basis to say, okay, what percentage of the supply base is has a high risk, and of course we can, what is high, what is low, you can argue what that is, and therefore, and what percentage of the spend is high risk, and then that's kind of that distilled information, which is the result of all that kind of repetitive low value work, but which delivers a very high value number, then that allows the category manager to inform and react to the situation and develop a category strategy, which is then ultimately very value adding overall, because then if we clearly see some weak points where we have, let's say, greater than 5% of the spend is in a high risk area, we can then allocate the necessary resource to address that risk and mitigate it. And I think then you're in a win-win situation. Whereas if you are burdening the organization with sending out questionnaires, doing all these risk assessments for the thousands of suppliers. I mean, I work in an organization where we have upwards of 30,000 active suppliers. If we're going to do a risk assessment on all of them, yeah, we'll be here till, well, I was going to say till Christmas, but we're here till probably Christmas next year.
And then you'll have to start again. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think, so distilling this information down to inform high value adding category strategies, and then to translate those strategies into a procurement plan makes it very tangible, and therefore we can mitigate those risks, and at the end of the day you end up with a supply base which is yes, where you get great value for money, but at the same time, the word value also means not just great operational or technological expertise, it also means low risk.
Yeah, and I guess it frees up the time to have more time to build those relationships, like we said, and it's picking up on cues, and some things that technology and data don't always do is that gut feel that you sometimes get when something doesn't feel right, or a conversation that you have has raised a bit of a red flag, and I guess that's another layer of value add that can that the human element overlaps with some of that. You can't really teach that gut feel. It comes something that comes with experience. But yeah, okay, great stuff. So according to the BCI, 50% of organisations fail to carry out due diligence beyond tier 1. What are the consequences of ignoring the dangers of failing to address third-party management issues? So Rogier, if I can come to you first. Now, tackling tier 1, it seems like a gargantuan task. Going beyond tier 1 can be incredibly daunting.
So it makes it even more cumbersome now, right? We talked about all these risk domains and all these cumbersome processes, and now we are telling you that you also have to do due diligence on your indirect suppliers and those 4th, 5th, 6th parties. So the question, I think, actually is here, what if you ignore those 4th, 5th, 6th party suppliers, right? Yeah, there's a big risk in them. We see that in several risk domains. I mean, especially if you look at the ICT cyber risks, you have your direct suppliers who work with definitely sub-providers, right? If you look at software that is in the cloud, they use cloud providers afterwards. If you don't know what type of technology they're using like behind the scenes, you're running a major ICT security risk. So first of all, it comes to understanding who are those sub-providers that they're working with. There needs to be transparency around that. So you need to at least have questions in your onboarding stage around which providers are you actually working. And when those happen in critical services, you have to also perform due diligence on those to ensure that they meet your standards as well. I gave the example of cybersecurity, but the same holds for ESG aspects, right? If we talk about human rights, I mean, especially when companies with a physical supply chain, you have the end product, but your suppliers are supplying you half fabricates, and they are working with plants maybe in countries, and you have no visibility on them, so you have no idea what the human rights are, then you have a really big blind spot and a potential huge issue from a human rights perspective or reputational risk. So it's really crucial that you map out that entire supply chain. That's the first start, maybe. So what is my supply chain? How does that supply chain map looks? And which are my critical suppliers? And which sub-providers or indirect suppliers are they using? And I think James already touched upon it. There are several regulations upcoming, particularly in Germany, the Lieferkettengesetz, so the Supply Chain Act in Germany, but also on an EU level, there's this initiatives about the CS3D, the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, that also asks this right now from organizations. Understand your entire supply chain. Then as well, from a concentration risk perspective, this is important, right? So if you don't have that overview of all the sub-providers that might be actually critical to you, you cannot measure that also from a concentration risk perspective. So there are several angles to it, but getting an understanding of who are those indirect suppliers, particularly the ones that deliver critical services, is crucial.
Thanks for that. I'm just going to remind everyone to submit questions. Don't leave it to the last minute because we're rapidly running out of time. So if you have a question to the panel, please put it in there. And I guess to lead on from that question, Rocky, if I can come back to you, it's like, how much of this responsibility can and should we push onto our tier one suppliers? How much of it do we need to just lift the bonnet up and get in there and have a look ourselves? And I guess it's all about balancing resources and trust, I guess, with both of that as well.
Yeah. Well, our platform is called Know Your Third Party, not Trust Your Third Party.
Okay.
So that's maybe a crucial statement. No, but obviously it's, you touch a good point, because it's a cumbersome task, and we are talking about efficiency here. A lot was already said about creating trust, good trusted relationship with your direct suppliers, particularly with the critical ones. So that's the first step. You have to have a good, robust relationship. And through that, you can definitely already get that transparency on who they are working with. But another point, and we also already discussed this, you need to then look at those indirect suppliers as well. And even if you have trusted relationship with direct suppliers, you might want to sort of consult other sources, data sources, platforms that give you that insight on that supply chain. And there are platforms, also features that we offer that gives you that insight, right, on trade schedules for different types of industries, how they flow, and which suppliers are working with each other. So don't just think that you can only get that through an answer from your direct suppliers. There are tools that can give you insights on the connectedness within the supply chain, and use those insights as well. Just don't just rely on one source. No,
it's particularly if you think that your tier one suppliers have all that information, it's quite possible they don't. So make sure that you know it. Yes,
exactly, because they might not know even.
Yes, they only know what they know. So I guess you can't rely on the information that they're sending to you. And we picked up on this, James, earlier, and about more legislation driving this kind of visibility and the need to get beyond tier one. And you mentioned the Due Diligence Act that's coming out as well, that will impact you and many organizations of people who have joined us today. And I guess it's about how we then manage responding to that kind of legislation, and how much resource really that's going to take organizations, or whether we have got that information at our fingertips.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the key point here is not to panic. We do have this legislation coming up, and but what basically the legislation is saying is that you need to be able to prove that you're taking, let's say, reasonable steps to mitigate risk within the supply chain. And unfortunately, as a first step, at least in Germany, we're only going down to the tier one suppliers. and therefore, that we have the necessary actions in place, to prove to the authorities that those reasonable steps are being taken. However, you're absolutely right, Emma. On the horizon, we do have this potential European legislation, which will be much more thorough. And by the way, I think the financial penalties for non-compliance are much steeper with the European legislation compared to national legislation. And this will involve, as Roger referred to, going deeper into the supply chain beyond the tier 1 and down into tier 2, 3, and 4, and even beyond in some cases. And I think we've had a clear wake-up call, I think, even in the past 12 months with the situation in Ukraine, where the Ukraine is normally a source of raw material, which you may see normally in deeper in the supply chain. We've had various examples in our organization where there have been supply chain bottlenecks, not linked to the traditional goods or services that you would associate with an airline, but things which have been going on deeper down in the supply chain, which have knock-on effects towards the customer and the customer of the customer, and so on. So I think the legislative landscape, and also I would say recent geopolitical events, have both conspired to ensure that we must be much more vigilant of mitigating risk deeper in the supply chain. And again, this is, once again, it's a kind of a journey, as they say, that we're on here, and I think all organizations are, and also the organizations that support us in that process, both from a data management and technology perspective as well. But I'm absolutely convinced that this is, let's say, one of the top priorities, if not the top priority, for procurement and supply chain organizations going forward, because if you just take environmental risk, for an example, everybody's talking about net zero, getting to net zero by whatever, 2030, 2050, or so on. So this is a topic that isn't going away, and I'm optimistic that in the next few years we will be in a situation where the transparency and the visibility across the supply chain and going deep and profound into the supply chain to mitigate risk will be available.
Great stuff. And I'll put this out to all of you. And I don't know how your thoughts on legislation being a driver for some of this, and whether it drives the right behaviours as well. Are organisations looking to be compliant, or are they looking to do their best possible efforts? It's one of the criticisms of the legislation in the UK, for instance, under modern slavery, is if lots of modern day slavery statements are written by lawyers because they're looking at it from a compliance point of view, are we then missing a trick here on not just doing our best efforts in this, and instead of looking at it from a legislative compliance perspective? I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up. Kate.
Yeah, I can maybe, it's a really interesting point. We see both with clients. We work with clients that, they're ticking every box from a legislative or regulatory compliance perspective, but probably not managing risk, adequately. It's become these beasts of a program was probably not the right word to use, but very administrative, very, very burdensome, very thorough. But maybe not taking sort of necessarily a real risk-based approach. There is, we have to do this due diligence on this supplier, and that's the be-all and end-all. There's no judgment being applied, or less judgment being applied. I think sometimes it depends maybe on the maturity of the organisation and the confidence, the maturity of the compliance department, and their level of comfort to make judgment calls on regulatory guidance, rather than just sort of taking it word for word. I think what has been interesting with sort of Bank of England and the PRA, they've been very, very, I'm going to use the wrong word. there's been a lot of consultation. They've been very front and center. They've joined a lot of webinars where they're hearing directly from the banks. And I think what we're seeing there, they've had a lot of feedback, and that has driven sort of the Bank of England and the PRA consultation on critical third parties and the framework and the regime there that they're considering. So I think there's, you know, a part that the regulators have to play, plus, you know, the big industry firms, the big bodies that can really influence and have a big voice coming together, maybe in consortia-led sort of discussions, and having that industry voice. But it's definitely a balancing act. And like I said, we see both across our client base. Some people saying we're just going to do the right thing for our organization and be very confident with that. And then others that are probably tick boxing, and they're going to be on a journey, I think, to unpick some of that over the next few years.
Yeah, I guess that the legislation is, if nothing else, getting small boardrooms discussions on these types of issues, which can only be a good thing. We've had a question through that I'd like us to just quickly pick up before you completely run out of time. As part of crisis management, and James, you picked up on some of these things, examples of COVID, Ukraine, solar winds, etc. How can firms approach the outreach challenge?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by the outreach.
No, I'm not quite sure about that, but perhaps how they can approach the challenge.
Yeah, I think the challenge in general, yeah, I mean, and of course, regarding crisis, I mean, let's all hope that all of the crises of this decade have been front-loaded into the first 2 years. But that's probably not the case, by the way, and the next crisis is only around the corner. So we have to be prepared. We have to be proactively prepared to manage crisis and risk management, and third-party risk management in the supply chain is obviously a key part of that. So I think, you know, if we talk about outreach, I mean, if we're outreach to the supply base means probably for me ensuring that there is that continuing ongoing dialogue with the supply base, in particular the strategic suppliers, to understand what their perspective is on upcoming risks, also to work out about changes in innovation, what's happening with also in the demand organization. I mean, so far in this conversation, we haven't discussed about the role of procurement and supply chain management in having the internal discussions within companies to say, okay, let's think about changing specifications, adapting products and services in order to mitigate supply chain risk. So that's that. So I think procurement organizations and buyers and category managers need to be also, I say, proactive and champions internally inside their own organizations in not just reaching out to the supply base, but also reaching out to their internal stakeholders to make risk management in the supply chain visible internally as well. Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Emma, if I can maybe pick up on this. I know we're almost running out of time. I just want to highlight that within KY3P, actually connected to this outreach, we have a very nice functionality. It's called SEND, Significant Event Notification Tracking, where you can literally start an event. So for example, the Ukraine war was one of them, and you have a specific set of questions that we then enter, and you can send that out to your complete supplier base just to understand from that event's perspective what they're doing, where they have suppliers, where they're located, etc. Just to get a sort of direct view from all your suppliers on where they stand related to that event. So I think this is, if we talk about outreach and outreach to suppliers for specific events, this could be a very nice feature.
Yeah, so looking at it from a particular incident or campaign approach on a particular area. Yeah, interesting. And that's perhaps some of the, as well as looking at things holistically, looking at particular impact of one incident as well, and how the knock-on effects of some of that. I think even during COVID, we were surprised at some of the knock-on effects that rose as we went through it. We were about out of time. I'm going to quickly run round the rest of the panel before we switch off. And what would your one piece of takeaway advice be for somebody who's tackling this? what would your piece of advice be to where they could start or where they could make the most impact? Kate, I'm going to go to you first.
There's a lot. So identify those low value transactional activities, outsource them, and then keep your expertise focusing, keep your expertise in-house, leverage external, keep your resources focused on your core competencies, and manage your strategically important suppliers.
Great advice. James?
Yeah, for me, just to repeat, third-party risk management for me is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end to ensure that we have great category strategies, a superb pipeline for sourcing activities and excellent contract management, and a nice, clean supply base inside our organizations.
Excellent. And Rochia, that last comment from you.
Agree, obviously, what was already said by Kate and James. Manage it from an holistic perspective. Don't manage it in silos. That brings definitely more cumbersome processes. Managing it holistically can bring major efficiency, and have technology and managed service to do that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Right, a little bit over, but hopefully everyone will forgive us that. Some real rich conversation there. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you for everyone who submitted a question. That was great too. A huge thank you to everyone taking the time to share their views and experience today. And a massive thank you to S&P Global again for partnering with CIPS on this series. They've been a real valuable suite of webinars. We have shared in the chat the 2 previous ones, and we will follow up with a recording of this one again. So watch again, share with your colleagues. We hope you found it insightful. Until then, we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Bye-bye.
Thank you.